evening scripture study. I'm excited about tonight. I love this book. We're going to be studying about Queen Esther. But before we do that, let's go ahead and have a prayer to start us off. Let me find my very favorite collect for Bible study, and we will begin with that. All right, almost there. Okay, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
So the book of Esther is one of those wonderful, triumphant stories of Jewish people living in exile in a foreign land under the rule of a person who is not one of them, but who has his good points along with his very impulsive and not so good points, and certainly has a lot of very corrupt advisors, one in particular. Before we start going through the book, and I'll have the book up for us to look at here on the screen. It's one of the stories that I was raised with because there's a whole holiday built up around the story of Esther. Does anyone know Esther's story? Mary O'Connor, could you give me the first little bit of it, and we'll see if anyone else can pick up where you leave off. Where are we and what's happening?
Oh, I don't know that stuff. I just I know about Haman and the gallows and Esther and the big banquet, and I just have sort of little bits of it. And the holiday is Purim.
That's right. The holiday is Purim. But you got the banquet, you got Esther, of course, you got Haman. What else?
Mordecai.
Well, oh yes, Mordecai. Mordecai is important. Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
Anyone
Queen
else?
Vashti.
Yes, Queen Vashti.
Well, I know someone named, well, she pronounces it Vashti.
Okay. I think it's more like
John
Vashti.
Tucker's sister-in-law.
Okay. It's a good biblical name, and Queen Vashti really gets kind of a raw deal in the Book of Esther, unfortunately. But she's.
Well, I also know someone named Esther, and I've been thinking there are so many people I know who have biblical names, but it was back in the day, not now. Because my sister-in-law Miriam, her sister Mary, and Martha, and
well, they've got all the
bases covered. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we added Mary O'Connor remembered Mordecai at the last minute. We've got Vashti, and then of course Esther again. Anyone else want to chime in with anything they might know about the book of Esther before we tell the story? It's a fun story. Well, it's actually kind of a bloodthirsty story, but you get to eat at the end. So okay. So as Mary pointed out, this book starts with a banquet, and you can see here in the very, very first. So this is Ahasuerus. Anyone know who Ahasuerus is in history? What name we might be more accustomed to knowing Ahasuerus as? How about Xerxes? Anyone know who Xerxes is? King of Persia?
Oh, yeah.
That's the guy. Ahasuerus.
Xerxes is a lot easier to say.
But not nearly as much fun. Ahasuerus. So we start in the kingdom of Ahasuerus, aka Artaxerxes. It makes more sense when you hear Artaxerxes, which is also the same thing as Xerxes. So this is a Persian ruler, and his kingdom is huge. And so he's got lots and lots of power, lots and lots of wealth, and lots of people from all kinds of places, following all kinds of religions under his care. And he's presented as kind of a not terribly bright, but genial guy, easily swayed, unfortunately, and a little bit. I don't know if anyone here watched Game of Thrones, but in the very beginning, the king of one of the kingdoms that was always out hunting and drinking beer and talking about women and all that kind of thing, he's kind of like King Ahasuerus. Okay, So he's having this banquet, and I want you to notice that he has a banquet lasting for 7 days. That is a very long time to sit around eating and drinking, but that is exactly what they do. And it goes into how wealthy he is. When we talk about the decorations and the furnishings that were in this banquet hall, it's linen and it's silver and marble and gold and mother of pearl and wine and drink after drink after drink for 7 days long, drink after drink after drink after drink. And Queen Vashti has a banquet for the women. They're separate because you don't party together. However, at the end of this banquet, when the king was merry with wine, and he would be, wouldn't he, after 7 days of drinking? Ooh, I wouldn't be very merry after that, but apparently he can handle it. So he drunkenly calls for the eunuchs of the court, go get my queen and bring her in here. Put all her royal crown and her nice clothes and bring her in here because she's beautiful. And I want to show off my wife to all these drunk men, which seems like a good idea.
Oh, yeah.
So the eunuchs go and they tell Queen Vashti, the king demands your presence. And she says, are you crazy? I'm not going to put on all these fancy clothes and go stand in front of a bunch of drunk men that I don't even know just because my husband wants me to. I'm not doing it. And she doesn't, which is a fairly bold move for a woman, even a queen, to make. And so the king is furious. And his officials say, wow, she really shamed you in front of all of these people, and all of the people that are whispering all around the kingdom. Did you hear that King Ahasuerus told his queen to show up at his banquet so he could show her off, and she said no? Well, that inspires us. We don't have to listen to what our husbands have to say either. And then, as now, when a bunch of women start conspiring against the men, there is great worry among the kingdom, right? And so he decides what he's going to do is he's going to find a new wife, one that is perhaps younger and more malleable and more obedient than Vashti, and who, by golly, is going to come to that banquet or anywhere else he demands when he asks her to come. And so he sends out these royal letters all over. Now, let's go back to the beginning here and see where he's sending these. 127 provinces from India all the way across the Middle East to Ethiopia, which is in Africa. So all over his kingdom, he sends out these royal letters. Send me your most beautiful young women. Young women and virgin are synonymous in this context. So he says, send me your youngest and most beautiful and most unspoiled women, because I am going to find another wife. And that is exactly what he does. So they bring all of these women into the kingdom. Now, one of them, in the very city where King Ahasuerus is located, in the citadel of Susa, which is where Ahasuerus is, there is a faithful man named Mordecai, and he is Jewish, and his family is Jewish, and he's a pillar of the people. And he has a lovely niece named Esther. So Mordecai is Esther's uncle, and he knows that all of this is happening. He knows also that all the time, now all throughout Old Testament in particular, but all throughout Scripture, the Jewish people are particularly persecuted no matter where they are. They have been conquered, they've been led into exile, they've gotten their country back, and they've lost it again. And so the theme here is we're always a people in danger, and this time is no exception. So Mordecai is struggling to keep his people, to keep the Jewish people together, to keep their identity and their faith strong. And he's raised Esther in the very same way. And so he's adopted her as his daughter, although she's really his uncle. It says cousin in this translation. Some say niece, some say uncle, that he is her uncle. He's a relative who has taken her on as his own daughter after her parents have died. And so as all of these people are gathered up, Esther is one of them, and she goes with all of the young women into Ahasuerus' kingdom. And they, for 1 year, one whole year, these women are kept under the care of other women in the harem, and they are given cosmetic treatments, it says. 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. I don't think Mary Kay has anything on the wonderful makeovers of Susa and Ahasuerus, but in any event, along with that is preparation of etiquette. How do you approach the king? How do you leave the king's presence? How do you deal with all these other women? How do you deal with servants? So a whole year long of learning how to behave as a not yet quite chosen favorite of the king. And so when it's time, after they've been there for a year, the girls go and they go into the king in the evening, and they spend time doing whatever it is that the king does and whatever he does with his concubines. And then in the morning, the eunuchs come and take the young girl away and bring her back to the harem. So when she goes in, apparently she is a lovely person and is very kind and makes friends, because when she goes in, the king's eunuch, the king's own eunuch, Haggai, tells her what to do. And whatever it is that she asks for, the woman is allowed to ask for something when she goes in, and the king may grant this favor. But whatever it is that the king's eunuch tells her to say, she says it. And King Ahasuerus says, this is the woman that I'm going to make my wife. She impresses me and pleases me more than any of these other thousands of women that have come through here. And so now she is queen. And he plucks the crown off of the head of Vashti and plops it on Esther's head. And then he gives another great banquet. He's really big on celebration and eating and drinking, evidently. He's kind of just like that. So Mordecai has told Esther, do not tell him, at least not yet, who you are, who your people are, where you come from, none of that. I'll hang out, I'll be close by, but you be careful, because we're never quite sure where our standing is with the royal kingdom and the people who are in charge of these things. So don't tell him, but I'll be close by. I'm going to sit right here at the king's gate. And so if you need me, you know I'm close by. So as he's sitting there, he overhears two more of the king's eunuchs, two more of his servants, that are plotting to kill him because they're unhappy with something that he's done. So on one of the times where Esther comes to check in with Mordecai and tell him how things are going, he says, you might want to tell King Ahasuerus that these two guys are plotting to kill him. And she does. And it's investigated, and they find that, yes, these two men were conspiring to kill the king. They punish these two men while they hang them, and it's recorded. This is important. So everything important that happens in the life of the kingdom, and particularly in the life of the king, is written down by somebody that can write, and it's written down so that if there's ever any dispute, they can flip back through the records and say, oh yes, it was at this day where these Bigthan and Teresh were convicted and executed for plotting against the king. So it's written down, it's on the record, and it seems to be forgotten, and we just move on. Now, after this, we see the ascension of this guy named Haman. And Haman is money hungry, power hungry, status hungry, and wants to be, if he can't be the king, and he can't because he's not of the royal line, he at least wants to be as close to royalty as he possibly can. And so one of the things that he makes happen is he says, as much obeisance and honor that you would give to King Ahasuerus himself, I demand that as well, because I am his right hand. And so all of the king's servants and all of the people, whenever he goes out into public, if people see him, they have to bow down and give him honor and defer to him and do whatever he wants. But Mordecai, and this is one of the instances where Mordecai is standing as sort of like an avatar of all Jewish people. Mordecai bows down to nobody except for God. Mordecai does not give those honors and give obeisance or homage to anything or anyone except for God. And so he stands up tall whenever Haman passes by. Mordecai is standing at the king's very gates. And when Haman goes in and out, Mordecai pretends like he's not even there. Doesn't bow down, doesn't scrape, doesn't do anything. And the king's servants say, why do you disobey him? But he doesn't really, they try and convince him to do it, but he's not going to listen. And so they tell Haman, we've noticed that this guy does not bow down to you. And of course, Haman has noticed it also, but knowing that other people see, here's this one defiant figure who, because he is a Jewish man, will not bow down to me, the right hand of the king, he becomes infuriated. But he thinks, it's tacky to get my own hands dirty by going after this man, Mordecai. So what I'll do instead, because this makes a lot of sense, instead of addressing this directly, I'll just make sure that all Jewish people are killed. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and say this is probably not an actual historical occurrence. This is, well, it's an apocryphal story. It's a story that tells the story of a larger story. So, as I said, Mordecai is sort of the figure of all good Jewish people here. Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, while Xerxes was an actual historical figure, this probably never happened in his rule. But he is standing for perhaps an ignorant, kind of well-meaning but easily swayed figure that for whatever reason throughout history has had charge over or control over what happens to these good Jewish people that are maintaining their faith in the midst of all of these other things that are going on around them. Haman, of course, stands for the groups of people or person that would say, you don't belong here. If you don't follow our rules and eat our food and bow down to our elected officials and so on and so forth, then all of you deserve to die. And we know that throughout history, that's happened multiple times in the life of the Israelites and of the Jewish people. So this is one of those stories where it's almost like a parable, more like the story of creation is analogous to the way the world was created and the world works. This also is analogous to the history of Jewish people throughout time. So Haman, when he says in this story, I'm angry at this one Jewish person, but I'm going to take it out on all of them. This is something that the Jewish people would have read or heard and thought, yep, that's exactly what happens, because historically that is kind of exactly what happens. One person or one smaller group of Jewish people take the blame for something wrongly that then ends up with all of this massive hatred and violence being stirred up against them. So this is that part of the story. So Haman knows then that Mordecai is Jewish. And so what he's going to do is wreak havoc and violence on the entire Jewish people. And so Pur, that's where our word comes from for Purim. Purim is a singular, or Pur is singular, a lot. So it's kind of like a fortune-telling device. You throw lots or a lot on the ground, and whichever way it lands and whatever symbology is associated with that, then you can project something into the future. If there are more than one, im is a pluralization of a Hebrew word. That works that way in Arabic too. So Purim is a festival of lots, plural, but it really was only one. So Haman throws this lot, this fortune-telling sort of device, and it says 11 months from now, from when you threw this, which will be the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar in the Hebrew calendar, you're going to rid as the entire kingdom of the Jewish people. So Haman, knowing this, goes to King Ahasuerus and says, I'm not going to name names because you have such a huge kingdom to deal with here. So I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to get too specific here, but you should know that there is one specific group amongst all your kingdom, wherever they happen to be, that don't really pay attention to you. They don't follow your laws. They do what they want to do. They don't keep your laws. I think it's really sending the wrong message to let them survive, honestly, because they're not doing what the king tells them to do. So as a favor to you, he presents it in that kind of way. Why don't you just go ahead and issue this decree that will allow people wherever these Jewish people, these group of people, let me issue this decree, or why don't you issue this decree that says, if you find this group of people wherever you are, you have license to kill them and rid the world of their existence. And in addition to that, I'll actually pay 10,000 talents of silver into your treasury. So Haman, Ahasuerus has no idea what Haman is talking about. He doesn't care. And he may have said no. But what he hears is money in my treasuries, a lot of money. Well, I don't really know who these people are, but it seems to bother you. And if you say they're a danger and you're also giving me 10,000 talents worth of silver, then sure, whatever, do whatever you want. Here's my signet ring, which if I take it off my hand and press it into a wax seal will be a mark that it's my decree and no one else's. I'm going to just hand this over to you. You write the letter and seal it with my ring and send it out to everyone in the entire kingdom. And whatever it is you're saying that is supposed to happen, that'll happen. And so off they go. The king's secretaries are sent out all across the kingdom to write, to give this letter to everyone. And it says, letters were sent by couriers to all of the king's provinces, letters that were written in the king's name, but by Haman, and sealed with the king's ring that Haman now has. And the letter says that you have orders. It's not just an option. You have orders to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jewish people, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is what the lot casting determined, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. So not only are you going to kill them all off, but you're going to take all their stuff too. And so out they go. And the king and Haman consider this a good day's work well done. And the city of Susa, and one would imagine all cities in the neighborhood or in the kingdom, as soon as they get this edict, are thrown into confusion. And it would, we're talking about where Jewish people, while not the majority, were still a significant proportion of the kingdom's population. And so it would be like something showing up in the newspaper or on Facebook or on the nightly news that says, all right, guys, 11 months from now on this particular day, I want you to go out into your communities and kill this group of people. It would be shocking, particularly to the people who were those people, or were their families, or were their friends. So thrown into confusion. As you might imagine, Mordecai is devastated along with the rest of his people. And so he does these traditional signs of mourning. He tears his clothes. He puts on rough burlap sackcloth as a penitence to try and bring favor onto the people, covers his head with ashes as a mark of mourning and as shame. And he goes through the city wailing. It's a very prophet thing to do, is to go through the city proclaiming this grief and this terrible news, and try and get people kind of stirred up about this. He goes back to the king's gate, and everywhere, all over the kingdom, wherever that decree showed up, which is everywhere, people are doing the same thing, fasting and weeping and lamenting, grieving and mourning in sackcloth and ashes. Now, Esther, nobody knows who she is, remember, only Mordecai and perhaps a few of their relatives. But in the kingdom itself, nobody has any idea who she is, who her people are, where she came from, that she herself is Jewish. And she goes to comfort Mordecai. She sends him clothes. She says, take that off so that you don't look like that. Maybe you can actually come in here and talk to me, because you can't come into the kingdom if you're dressed in sackcloth and ashes. Nobody's allowed in here like that. He refuses to do that. So she sends one of her eunuchs to go and talk to him, since he can't come to her. And he tells her the letter that has showed up all over these places. And he also knows, because he sits at the king's gate and hears all this chatter, he knows how the transaction happened. He knows that Haman is responsible. He knows that Haman has the king's ring and has paid all this money to make this happen once the Jews are completely destroyed. And he gives the eunuch a copy of that letter so he can give it to Esther and see, so she can see what it says, because she wouldn't know any of this. She's kept sequestered from any business parts of the running of the kingdom, because it's not her business. She's just the queen. She's just a woman. Why should she need to know any of this? And what could she do about it anyway? The reader might think. So he says, he gives this message. She gives Mordecai a message through the eunuch, and she says, well, I would like to go and talk to him about this, but I can't go and speak to him unless he invites me. And if I go in there without being called, I will be put to death. Only if he extends the golden scepter to me when I approach him am I allowed to actually talk to him and go and see him. And I haven't been to see him actually for 30 whole days. I don't know what's going on. And Mordecai says to her, with this intermediary that's doing this communications for them, he says, don't think that they won't find out eventually, and don't think that you will escape our fate as a Jewish person any more than the rest of us. And he says, if you keep silence at such a time as this, perhaps we'll be saved in some other way, but I will die, and your father's family will probably die. And he says, who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. I love those phrases. I love the "such a time as this" phrasing, because it's often that I have found myself kind of caught between a rock and a hard place and thinking, well, gosh, what do I do from here? I have no idea what to do. And I remember these words and I think, well, if you don't know what to do, perhaps you have been put into this place to be given this knowledge, to be given this wisdom, to act in ways that must be necessarily creative and different, and not something that plays by the book, because there is no book for this. When you find yourself in a confusing situation, it might help to think, well, this is very strange and it doesn't look as though I have any options, and I'm exactly the wrong person at the wrong time to be dealing with this, but perhaps it is for just such a time as this that a person like me is put into a situation as strange as this one is. I found that to be comforting. Maybe you can call on it too. So she thinks about that and she decides he's right. And she says, here's what you do. Go and gather everyone you know, hold a fast for me, pray for me, 3 days, night and day, don't eat, don't drink, and just pray all the time. And I and all of my ladies in waiting will do the same thing. When we're all done praying as hard as we can, even if it's against the law, I'm just going to go and try and talk to him. And if I die, I die. But it's the only way we'll ever have the chance to try and fix this. So Mordecai goes back, and all of the families and all of the friends go into mourning and praying and fasting, and for 3 days. So on the 3rd day, Esther gets all dressed up. She puts on all the clothes that she knows the king's like. She goes and stands in his inner court. And he is sitting, so you can see her. She's not really approaching him. She's just sort of standing there. And he sees her, and he must be very fond of her, because as soon as he sees her, he extends the golden scepter, which is the way of saying, you may approach, which is a little weird, but okay. She goes in and she touches the scepter, and the king says, what brings you here? I'm very fond of you. And again, in this very impulsive, not thinking things through manner, I'm going to get rid of my wife and get a new one. I'm going to sign this thing that Haman suggests, even though I have no idea what he's talking about, and I'm putting the lives of thousands and thousands of people at risk. Here's my queen. She looks so pretty today. I'll give you anything you want, even if it's half of my entire kingdom. But he said it, and a king's word he must live by, because sometimes that's the only thing that people can go on. So he has to honor his own word. So he tells her, whatever you ask for, I'll give it to you, even if you ask for half of my entire kingdom. And she says, oh, not so much. But, I'd like to have a little dinner party for you and Haman. It's for you, of course, but I would like it if you asked Haman, because I want to please you. And he says, well, that's a great idea. Bring Haman and we'll have her put on a dinner party, a nice banquet for us. So they come. And they're drinking wine, and one would assume that Esther is not drinking as much as the men, and one might assume that she's making sure that they drink perhaps a little bit more than they ought to, because they're relaxed and they're happy and they're enjoying the presence of the queen. Moreover, Haman is just about over the moon, because not only is he sitting next to the king, he always gets to do that, but the queen, this beautiful, beautiful queen that the king handpicked himself out of thousands of women all over the kingdom, the queen asked for him. So very fancy. Haman is feeling quite important right now. And the king says again, what else do you want? Anything else that you want? What is your petition shall be granted to you. And whatever your request is, again, even to the very half of my kingdom, I will give it to you. And Esther says, all right, well, if you really want to know, if you're happy with me, and if you really are going to grant me my petition and my request, why don't we have another banquet tomorrow? And then we'll learn more. So Haman goes out and he's feeling very good, because not just one, but two banquets that he gets to attend with the king and the queen. But then he sees Mordecai. And even in the midst of Mordecai's grief and fear and sackcloth and ashes, he refuses to get up and pay this physical honor to Haman. And he's infuriated, but he just reins it in and goes home. And he goes and he speaks with his wife. And he speaks with his friends, and they're all gathered together, and he's telling them how wonderful he is and how rich he is and how many sons he has and what the king has done for him and how he's so much higher up than anyone else. I have to say, he doesn't sound like a very pleasant companion. He sounds a little narcissistic, actually, Because if we've ever been in the presence of somebody who just could not tell you enough about themselves and how wonderful they are, it gets a little old. But apparently his wife is kind of cut from the same cloth, because as he's telling them about this banquet that they're having tomorrow, and he says, well, I am so awesome and wonderful and amazing that even the queen wants me around all the time. But I'm still, despite all this that I have, that I've just told you about in exhaustive detail, I still get so angry when I see this guy Mordecai. And so his wife, who doesn't seem to be much good, and his friends, who don't seem to be all that great either, what they say is, you should just build a gallows and then have him hanged on it. And then you can go to the banquet and eat well, because that's what everybody wants to do after seeing an innocent man get hanged, is go have a nice meal. And he says, well, that's a great idea. I'll do that. So he has a gallows made up. And a gallows, of course, is where somebody is hung when they're executed. So that same night, as Haman and Zeresh and their friends are plotting to build this gallows to kill Mordecai, the king is having a restless night. Now, you remember that way back in the beginning of Esther, we had that thing where Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate, heard about those two eunuchs who were chattering and plotting to kill King Ahasuerus, and how he alerted the household and how they were brought to justice and executed. And that all got written in the book of Annals, in these records. The king is so insomniac that night that to put himself to sleep, he asks for the book of records to be read from throughout his reign. And so he must be really sleepless, because I can't imagine anything more tedious than being read a book of records. I mean, it would have the least to the greatest in there, and I'm sure not all of it was very exciting. But as they're reading this book of records to him, they read about this incident where this honorable and good Jewish man named Mordecai saved the king's life, more or less, by alerting him to the presence of these two conspirators. And he said, oh yeah, I had forgotten about that guy completely. What did we do for him? And the servants say, nothing. I mean, he's still just sitting out there in the gate most of the time, but no, you didn't honor him, you didn't reward him, nothing happened. And as they're talking about this, it must be getting on towards morning, Haman has just come in after having built the gallows, and he wants to talk about Mordecai being hanged on these very gallows. So they're having this discussion, and the king's servants say, oh, that noise you heard out there is Haman. He wants to come and talk to you. So before Haman has a chance to explain, look, I just built this great big gallows and I'm going to hang this guy Mordecai on it, the king says, but, I have a question for you. What do you think I should do for someone that I really would like to honor and reward? And Haman, being Haman, of course thinks, well, the king can't be talking about anyone except for me. So he thinks, what would I want? Because that's who it's going to be. I know he's talking about me. So what would I want? He's okay, for someone, that mysterious man that the king would like to honor, that I don't know who it is at all, why don't you put some royal robes on him that look as nice as yours? In fact, they would be yours. They're clothes that you have worn yourself. And I, if I were you, would give this mystery man a horse that is fine enough that you yourself have ridden it. And I would put a crown on that horse's head. That's how important it is. And then they would dress this man and put him on the horse, and I would take him on horseback all throughout the city, yelling out before him, this is the man that the king honors, this one right here. And the king says, what a great idea. So here, I'm going to give you these robes, and I'm going to hand you the reins to this horse that you're talking about, and I want you to give them to Mordecai, who's sitting right out there outside the gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman, and you can just imagine the look on his face, has these gorgeous, elaborate, luxurious robes and this beautiful horse with a little crown on its head, and he brings them out to Mordecai. And he rides him all throughout the city, saying, thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. You can just imagine he's so angry. So Mordecai comes back, probably more confused than you could possibly imagine as to all this. And Haman is just completely downcast, completely miserable. And he tells his wife and his friends again everything that's happened. And they say, if you don't fix this, you're sunk. Because if he's going to honor Mordecai like this, then they're never going to carry out your plan. But they can't come up with any ideas before the king's eunuch and tap him on the shoulder and say, it's time for that banquet that you're so excited about going to. Let's go. So off they go. And Haman and the king and Esther are going in, and it's another multiple day feast, because on the second day, as they're drinking wine, I mean, these people's livers must have looked like Swiss cheese by the time they were all done. So they're all drinking wine on the second day, and the king says, my beloved Queen Esther, now what would you like? Anything at all, anything you want, because she hasn't asked for much so far. She wanted a nice dinner party. She got one. She wanted another one. She got that. He's waiting for her to ask for something big. He says, even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. And she says, well, this one is a big one, but if you're happy with me and you're really willing to grant this favor that you promise, give me my life, because my life is in danger, and the lives of my people, because the lives of my people are in danger. We were sold for 10,000 talents worth of silver so that we could be destroyed and killed and annihilated and all of our goods plundered. If we had been able to keep our lives, I wouldn't have said anything, but no enemy, she says, can compensate for this damage to the king, because ultimately it would have been very damaging to a ruler to completely annihilate a group of people who were under his care and who had done nothing wrong. And King Ahasuerus says, what? Who would have done such a thing? Who would have put your people at risk like that? Who would have devised such a terrible plan? Who is he? Where is he? Who has presumed to do this? And Esther, and it just sounds like a wonderful scene. You're going to see her standing from her chair and flinging her hand out. And she says, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. And Haman, knowing that every word she says is true, is just petrified. So the king, in a rage, gets up and storms out into the garden to pace around and have a moment to himself. Haman is just blubbering and begging and clinging to Queen Esther's feet. Oh, please, 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 don't let him kill me. Don't let him kill me. He's thrown himself on the couch where she is sitting, grabbing at her, begging her. And that doesn't present a very favorable impression when King Ahasuerus comes in from the garden and hears this evil man slobbering all over his wife, who he has tried to kill. Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house? And they come and drag him off. And one of the eunuchs says, oh, what an odd coincidence this is, because look, here's this brand new gallows right here that was supposed to go for Mordecai, but wouldn't it just be hilarious if we put Haman on it instead? And the king says, it would indeed. Hang him on that. So that's what they do. And the king says, all right, well, all's fair in love and war. I guess we're even. Mordecai comes in. He becomes then the bearer of the king's signet ring and his right-hand man. She then says, you know, what you've got to do, though, this is great, but my people are still at risk because those letters are still out there all over your kingdom, and your people are going to act on them. I can't bear that. I don't care if I live so much as all of these people who are now at risk because of these letters. And he says, well, this is the tricky part. That letter that was written in my name, and it was sealed with my ring, and I cannot revoke it. But this is a horrible story towards the end, quite frankly. But what I can do is write a letter to the people who are in danger. So I can write a letter to the Jews that instruct them to do something as well. And so what this letter says is, on this day where you are supposed to be killed, what you can do instead is to assemble and create an army and defend your lives and defend the lives of your women and children, and to destroy and to kill and to annihilate any armed force that might come against you. So he says you can create for yourselves a counterforce. And in a lot of these places, there are a lot more of you than there are of them. So you can go, you can attack them, you can take them out before they take you out, you can take their stuff, you can do whatever you want to save yourselves. You can defend yourselves even unto death in order to preserve your people. And so that letter goes out. So in Susa, where the kingdom is, all is light and gladness and joy and honor. And there's great joy and rejoicing when this edict comes all over the kingdom that says, hooray, you can go kill people who want to kill you. Old Testament for you. That's how that works. And many of the people, in fact, say, me? No, I'm Jewish. I'm absolutely Jewish. I'm not going to be attacked and killed by the Jewish people. I myself am Jewish. I'm going to convert to Judaism right now. So not only does it preserve the faith, it actually increases the faith. And when that day comes, all of the Jewish people gather in their cities, and they're all armed, and they're all raring to go, and all over, including in the citadel of Susa, where the king is, but all over the kingdom, that's exactly what they do. They defend their lives, they gain relief from their enemies, but what they don't do is take the plunder. They don't do it in Susa when they rise up against the people who might kill them there. And all over the kingdom and all in the provinces, they defend themselves, they kill, it says 75,000 of those who were trying to kill them first, but they don't take their stuff. So here we see kind of that difference between what's more important to you. Is the material stuff important to you? The people who were under, well, it was the king's edict, but it was Haman that wrote it. So we see Haman as being this man possessed only by a love of status and wealth and material goods. Whereas you see the Jewish people as violently defending their lives, it's true, but for the sake of who they are as a people, and not because it certainly is not going to give them any more power. They're going to be as powerless afterward as they were before, and certainly not in order to gain more material goods or material wealth, because although they could have taken all of these goods and treasures from the people that they killed, they don't do it. They say, we just wanted to be safe. We just wanted to preserve our people. And that's what they do. So then this is where they institute the feast. And so the day after that, the 14th day of the month of Adar, is where they have this big feast and send gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. So again, kind of saying, this is not about material goods for us. This is about sharing the wealth of who we are as God's people. So every year, this is celebrated. And this just kind of goes into how the feast day is initiated and the happy ending here, which is Mordecai remains the highest man in the land aside from the king. And of course, Esther does as well. And more importantly, he's powerful among his own people. He is honored among his own people. He didn't do anything sneaky or underhanded or dishonorable to gain the trust of a king and to get a high place within the kingdom. He never asked for it. He never angled for it. But the kind of person that he was is what makes him so honored and so revered even now. Mordecai is a name of honor because he did the right thing and was brought into a kingdom and had great power, but he used it so that his own people would be saved and not just his own skin. So has anyone ever been to a Purim festival before? It is fun. It is great fun. And when I was little, you don't talk about the last part. What you hear about is kind of dim-witted King Ahasuerus, beautiful rejected Queen Vashti, even more beautiful and honorable Queen Esther, wonderful honorable Mordecai, and evil terrible Haman. And you get that little nugget of a story. Haman bad, Esther good, people saved, hooray. That's kind of the story you end up with. But they tell a detailed story of those people and their roles in it without going into a whole lot of detail about where the edict went and what happened that the Jews can go then and kill all these other people. That doesn't come into it much, but they do tell about Esther, Mordecai, Ahasuerus, and Haman. And while they're telling the story, so the parties that I would go to when I was a little kid, it's sort of like Halloween because you're supposed to dress up. You're supposed to dress up as a king or as the bad guy Haman or as Queen Esther or as Queen Vashti. And so you come in costume of one of those people. And I assure you, a lot of the Queen Esthers that I saw and that I was as a little kid look an awful lot like Disney princesses, but that may be a cultural thing. So you show up and all the kids sit around in a circle and they give you noisemakers, and they either are store-bought ones that are like a little flag of metal on a stick, and when you wave it around, it makes this really harsh grating sound. Or you get just maracas or castanets or noisemakers. And if you don't have any of that, you can just yell and boo at the top of your voices whenever the words or the name Haman is mentioned. The whole place just erupts in all of this noise because people are shaking maracas and doing their noisemakers and going boo, boo, ah, and the kids just love it. So you hear the story and you make your opinions known about Haman whenever his name is mentioned. And at the end, you get to have the big party. And anyone know what the food is that's associated with Purim?
Hamantashen.
That's right. And you know what that means?
Haman's hat.
Yes. So they're these little triangular pastries, and they're filled with fruit filling, like apricot or prune. Those are the ones actually those are pretty much the only ones I ever got, were apricot and prune filled little pastries and dusted with a little powdered sugar. And you don't eat Haman, but you get to eat his hat. And that's kind of like, ha ha, you're a bad man. All that's left of you is your hat. We're going to eat it. And then that's the party. But it's fundamentally for the adults and for more theological, spiritual purposes, what this really is a story of two very faithful and honorable people who were able to save their entire people. And it's also really important for us to see this because the primary mover, or one of them anyway, is a woman who ordinarily would have had no power whatsoever. In the beginning of the story, we see Queen Vashti, who exercises a very petty kind of power. And for that very petty exercise of power, she is booted out. And so that's like in the beginning, that's a clear kind of squashing of any kind of powerful woman theme, what you might think. And when you hear about King Ahasuerus bringing all of these beautiful young virgins into the kingdom, you think, well, that's not very empowering, is it? But the one that he chooses is intelligent, compassionate, and seeks to do good to her people when she didn't have to. She was living the easy life. And Mordecai tells her, they're going to find out that you're Jewish also. You are not safe either. But he doesn't really know that. She probably could have kept the secret for quite some time if she had wanted to, but she doesn't want to. She wants to be honest and clear about who she is and who her people are, and that they do not deserve to be murdered at the hands of all of these different people in the kingdom for any reason, certainly not for no reason at all. And she seeks justice, and she gets it. So all of that being said, I think it's a great story. What are your impressions? Any thoughts on the story of Esther and Mordecai and Haman and Ahasuerus, etc.?
I think it would make a great movie. And I think it shows how powerful women are.
Tell me more about that. What makes Esther powerful? We agree.
Well,
we agree.
Well, she was first of all, she was beautiful. She was quiet, but yet in her mind, she was programming to save people, and and today I think we have lots of women who are empowered to do that, and it just makes you feel good. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you, Brenda. Mary?
It reminds me of other stories in the Bible of the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who would not bow down.
Mm-hmm.
So they were thrown into the fiery furnace. I don't even remember what book that's from.
Daniel.
But, okay. And the whole idea of Jews being, owing their allegiance to God rather than to an earthly kind of ruler is kind of echoed in that.
Yes.
And the whole idea of, okay, then we'll kill all of you, obviously makes you think of the Holocaust. And like you said, there are many times when they tried to kill all the Jews. So it seems to be a story that's echoed again and again throughout history.
It's almost as though a lot of scripture stories operate that way, where it's something that you see happening over and over and over again. And the stories that scripture tells really are the story of humans and humans and humans and God, over and over and over again, these repeating themes. That's Tilly, I know, her little head just popped up. So yes, and the other thing that's worth noting is Esther does not have many ways to exercise any power. One of the things that is a stumbling block for her in the beginning is that if I go to him when I am not sent for, my life is in danger. And if I die, then everybody dies. But if I don't do something, everybody dies. So this is the power for Esther lies in her bravery, most of all. It's a wonderful accident when people are born beautiful. And it doesn't happen for everyone, but it's a wonderful accident when people are. And she is willing to exercise that to her advantage. Good for her. But the strength and the power come in the fact that she knows that for all she knows, if she walks into his court without being summoned, he could very well turn himself and his golden scepter away from her, which would be the sign that she's now going to be put to death. But she takes the risk and she goes to him and says, I have to try, because if I don't try, they're going to die for sure. And he might just extend favor, which is thankfully what he does. But it really is a story about bravery in the face of certain death. If I don't do something, everyone is going to die. Right?
I have another thought about this story. I've always thought when I read it, how did Esther feel about being chosen in the first place? I mean, they went all over the country looking for the most beautiful women, and they looked at her and said, you. And she might have been quite happy with her life the way it was. But no, we're gonna take you off to the palace and we're gonna make you pretty for a year.
Right.
It just, what a huge life change. And she was able to deal with that too.
Well, now that you mentioned that, Mary, I think that kind of speaks to the not particularly, but to the Jewish people's experiences of massive displacement, for one thing, and surviving and thriving in spite of that. I think that what you just said is another key to why the Book of Esther is so important. All throughout the beginning of their history, Jewish people have tried to make a stand where they are, but they get dragged into slavery in Egypt, and they escape Egypt and they establish their own country, and they get dragged into exile in Persia or dragged into exile in Babylon. And all of these times where they're pulled away from who they would really like to be, and they have to not just make do with where they end up, they have to do well where they end up. And that's not just the story of Jewish people, it's a story of a lot of different people all over the world who have been booted out of their homelands. But it's certainly worth mentioning, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because that aspect of the story had not really occurred to me. What would it be like to be a young girl in the country, with an orphan essentially, but with your kind Uncle Mordecai that helps you out, and they say, "You, kingdom now." That would be very shocking. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other points from the Book of Esther we would like to bring out? Okay. Well, I think that as a real juxtaposition of female power, I think next week we should do the Book of Judith, which is in the Apocrypha. Judith wields power as well, but in an incredibly different way from Esther. And if you haven't read the story, go ahead and flip through it. It's terrible. It's one of those things that you read and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm glad the good guys won, but they're not really the good guys sometimes. It's a good story, and again, probably not at all historically accurate, but another kind of analogous or parable type story about we're going to do whatever we can to make sure our people survive. Most of the stories that we end up seeing especially stories about individuals. Books about the prophets tell you a longer history about a larger group of people. Books about individuals tend to tell you about the importance of one person standing for perhaps a small group of people that says, no more, this far, no further. I, as a person of tremendous faith and someone who will not bow down and follow rules unless it is for God and God alone, I am going to draw my line in the sand, and this is where we're going to stop this. It's really kind of fascinating. If you go through the histories, you'll see the histories. If you go through the prophets, you'll see a more history of larger groups of people. If you find the books, not the singular people, the books of the prophets are under the name of a singular person. Those aren't the books I mean. I'm talking about the book of Job, the book of Esther, the book of Judith, where you see a person who has this remarkable role as somebody that's holding back the floods. That's what the individual stories in the Old Testament really are about. And I wanted to point out one more thing. Mary, I think it was you that said how frustrating it is when you have a group of people who are so faithful to God that they refuse to become idolaters of anything else. That gets carried into the Gospels in the ultimate way, because what you have at the end of the Gospels is Jesus, who is crucified because he refuses to do just that. I am not going to stand for this idolatry anymore. I worship only God. What you say about God and the rules that you have made over these millennia that actually serve you and not your neighbor and not God are not rules that I will live by. And he pays the ultimate price for that. So that's not something that was lost, that was something that was with the Israelites and the Jewish people and then drifted away when it became the church, or at least it shouldn't have. That's something that should still be very much with us now. We have a lot of people in our lives who are powerful and who can exert power. That being said, it would be good for us to remember that the only entity worthy of complete loyalty and worship is God. That's something that we tend to forget, and we're encouraged, I think, to forget that. But we shouldn't, because that's really where our true hearts should lie. Anything else for the good of the order this evening? All right. Well, I am so glad that all of you were here. I'm so glad that people were joining us on Facebook and YouTube, as I know they were. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. I'll hopefully see you all on Sunday morning, and hopefully see you Wednesday night next week, or Thursday night next week, or some other time very soon. Be safe, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.